Hi, welcome to More Christ. I'm Marcus. I'm joined once again by the delightful Dr. Os Guinness. Os is an author, a social critic, and a great-great-grandson of Arthur Guinness, the Dublin brewer. Os has written or edited more than 30 books now that offer valuable insight into the cultural, political, and social contexts in which we all live. He completed his undergraduate degree at the University of London and his D.Phil in the social sciences from Oriel College in Oxford. Today, we'll be homing in primarily on his lovely new book, Signals of Transcendence, listening to the promptings of life. First, though, I wanted to explore something that I thought was most interesting, and we were speaking about just before we started recording. Recently, you've had this experience as part of a wonderful Exodus series on the Daily Wire with Jordan Peterson. Could you tell us maybe a bit about that and what you took away from that series then?
Well, it was a great privilege to join Jordan on that. I've written a book on Exodus, and I believe passionately that Exodus is a classic. I mean, you think of Plato, Machiavelli, John Stuart Mill, but Exodus should be right up there with those classics of the Western world because it's the master narrative of Western freedom. And it's played a direct impact on, say, the American experiment, something on the English Revolution. So we really need to understand Exodus. And it was a great privilege to be a part of Jordan's team. Very mixed group, all sorts of crazy ideas expressed, but it was truly fun and a privilege to be a part of it.
No, excellent. And I think what I was thinking about in relationship to your book was Jordan would almost fit into the book maybe in part for his own story and then the impact that he's having on other people. I wonder, do you discern any particular signal of transcendence specific to him and what the work that he's doing that you think is maybe worth taking note of for the wider society or for Christians? Does that make sense?
Well, he's an incredibly passionate and a very honest man. So he's moving. I mean, he's exploring all the time. And I admire him for that. So he's not stuck in some position that he's arguing over against everyone. He's really thinking things through all the time. So he is moving. And I personally, as a follower of Jesus, hope he moves further towards a genuine faith, but he's moving.
Amen. And what, I suppose, do you think is most significant about the work that he is doing on the Bible specifically? And maybe, I suppose, to your point, where would you like to see that go next then?
Well, he brings with it a great rich heritage of psychology. I would challenge him a bit. He sometimes gets stuck in his Jungian categories, and I think there are many more. And you can't reduce, say, the book of Exodus just to psychological categories. It's all about the freedom and founding of God's society, God's people. So it's got political and social and all sorts of other aspects too. But he is a very rich thinker, and I've never been with him for a dinner or a week or 2 weeks without going away having learned so much. Magnificent man.
Yeah, amazing. Thanks for that, Oz. And you also work closely with my friend Jonathan Pageau, who we were just speaking before we started recording that we're doing an event which I'm most excited about in Dublin this year. I wonder what you thought of his work and his approach, which is very different from Jordan's. It's focused on the cosmic nature of the Christian faith and symbolism and how that resonates with your own work. And what do you think is maybe richest about that for Christians going forward?
Well, he's the master, as you know, of symbolism and so on. Much of that is way, way beyond the things that I'm passionately interested in. But I love working with Jonathan. He's got a deep, rich faith, very intelligent, with a great sense of history. So he's a wonderful person to have round the table, or in your case, for the seminar with him. What a privilege.
I'm into that, Oz. Thank you so much for sharing a bit of that, your wonderful recent work. And I want to now move on to your excellent new book that we mentioned, Signals of Transcendence, Listening to the Promptings of Life. So, in that book, you begin by describing the current moment, what these signs are, and how they sound different to different people. Can you tell us a bit about that for starters, then?
Well, think, Marcus, we're modern people, but we're very close to the situation Plato described in his famous parable of the cave. And you remember the prisoners in the cave had no light except what was thrown by the fire behind them. So reality for them was the flickering shadows on the wall. And if someone, by any stroke of luck or whatever, escaped from the cave and tried to come back in, everyone in the cave thought he was a madman. And they wanted to stay where we were because that was all they were used to. Now, my mentor, Peter Berger, describes modernity, the modern world, as a world without windows. C.S. Lewis called it a windowless world. You know, traditionally, not just in Ireland, but all around the world, and not just Jews and Christians, but people of all religions, the unseen was never unreal. In fact, whatever the faith was, the religion was, the unseen was more important and decisive than the seen. And people understood things as basic and down to earth as sex or business in the light of the unseen world. But the feature of the modern world is the unseen is unreal. Now we're in Plato's cave. We're in this world without windows. We've been, as Max Weber put it, disenchanted. And I think you think too, and others like Paul Kingsnorth think, we need a massive breakout, an awakening, so that people wake up to the incredible importance and the reality of the transcendent and unseen world. And that's what these signals do. So my book is not an argument. It's a series of 10 different stories of people who've had these experiences of signals of transcendence, and they've been promptings and triggers that have launched them out as seekers and searchers, and that's the key thing.
Excellent, thank you, Oz. And I love the mixture of your book of these lovely personal vignettes. You tell these great stories about these individuals and point to the kind of subjective and objective relevance of their calling as that relates to how they're meant to live the Christian life and so on. And one figure that you touch upon who I came away most impressed by was Malcolm Muggeridge. A great character, seems possessed by the truth and almost Augustinian as he goes through this faith in socialist politics and so on before eventually finding God. Can you maybe share a bit of his story and why it's really so captivating then?
Well, he's one of those in the book that I knew personally. When I was a student at Oxford, a graduate student, he used to come and he invited my wife and me down to his home. Wonderful, wonderful man, eminent journalist. But many of his biographers said the same thing. He knew what he disbelieved before he knew what he believed. He did not like BS, bunkum. And if you know his story, he went to Cambridge and considered it one of the worst experiences of his life. He then went to the Soviet Union, and he was one of the very first to see through Stalin, when so many, the New York Times and many others, were just completely blindsided by Stalin's propaganda. Muggeridge saw through it, came back disillusioned with education after Cambridge, disillusioned with politics after the Soviet Union. So he went to India, thinking maybe religion in India would give him an answer. And some years there, nothing. So when World War II broke out, he was seconded by the intelligence service to East Africa to monitor German shipping. Not exactly one of the key parts of the war. And for him, it was just the epitome of the uselessness. And one day, as he said, in his bed with stale smoke and stale beer, he thought, well, there's one contribution he can make to the war, one person he could kill, himself. So reaching the end of his tether, he decided to commit suicide. Went down to the beach in Mozambique, undressed, and swam out into the ocean. But before he went down, he happened to look back over his shoulder, and somehow he saw the lights of the cafe and the little town he'd left. And for the first time in his life, they struck him as home. There was home in this crazy, absurd universe. He turned round and swam back. He said it was as if a light came to him in Plato's cave. So from then on, he set out to search where was the foundation for this home and a sense of belonging in the universe. It was actually decades before he came to faith. But that was the key moment because it set him off in the search.
Excellent. Thank you, Oz. And you also knew Peter Berger personally and were educated under him. I suppose, what do you remember about him most fondly, and what about his work and his story should really still strike us?
Well, I did my doctorate on him, one of the first to do that. So he became a mentor and then a great friend. What a character he was, extremely funny, always with jokes. He wrote a book on humor. He said most books on humor are humorless. So he determined to put a joke almost every page to try and make a book on humor funny. And that was Peter Berger. He was absolutely wonderful. Now, his idea of the signals of transcendence comes in his little book in the 1960s, A Rumor of Angels, just one chapter. And I thought they were so brilliant. I talked to him about it, and we were going to write a book together. It probably would have been a very different one. Sadly, he died. But at the end of his life, my wife and I saw him often. He was a man of very deep faith, which to many people who know his sociology was rather a surprise. He was a man of very deep faith. So the book is dedicated to him. Now, I love it's an unusual one. It's the second chapter. He starts with what he calls the prototypical experience of a mother comforting a child in the night. A child wakes up with a nightmare or a sound that he hears and starts crying out. And the mother picks up the child and says in so many words, it's going to be all right. Everything's going to be all right. A prototypical comfort and reassurance. But Berger says, wait a bit. Everyone understands that. And every mother says that in good faith. But is it in fact true? I mean, if you think more seriously, everything's not going to be all right. The mother herself is going to die, and eventually the child will grow up and will die. This is a crazy world, and risk and precariousness are written all the way through it. Now, what gives us the grounding, the foundation for saying it's going to be all right? There is order in the universe, despite all the chaos and disorder. And so for him, it was a signal of transcendence that set him off on the search.
Excellent. Thanks, Oz. And I think your work, like Berger's and like Peterson, people like that who we mentioned, is doubly captivating at that kind of individual and societal level, in part because it does see the struggles with death and with secularism, but sees through them and wrestles seriously with those questions. And I mentioned before we started recording again about a project that the pastor Paul Vanderklay has established on the back of his videos about Jordan Peterson, reaching out to different Christians and non-Christians and so forth, wrestling with the big questions in the 21st century. And one of the members of our group was actually kind of militant atheist, moving to agnostic, and then, thank God, just recently returned to the faith. And glory to God for that. But he was deeply impressed by another figure that you mentioned in the book, Auden. And Auden's work, you tell his kind of turbulent story and how he wrestled with problems of evil and things like this. Can you maybe share a bit about him and his story and why maybe he speaks so powerfully to the current moment then?
That's probably my favorite story in the book among the 10. Auden, as you know, left Oxford University a young celebrity. He was an atheist. He was gay before it was fashionable to be gay. And he was on the radical left and fought against Franco in the Spanish Civil War. But when World War II was looming, he and his gay partner came to New York to escape the worst of the war. And of course, in those days, they wanted to follow what was happening in Europe, no television. So if you wanted to see anything, apart from reading the newspaper or listening to the radio, you went to your local cinema to watch the documentary on the Pathé News on Saturday. And he was living in the Upper East Side. Now, of course, in 1939, Britain was fighting Germany, and Germany was fighting Britain. But America was neutral. America was not involved. So the Germans supported the Germans, and many supported the Brits. Well, he went to the cinema, and unbeknownst to him, it was largely a German audience in that part of New York. And the film was on the siege of Poland. And Nazi stormtroopers were bayoneting women and children brutally. But right through the evening, the German crowd were on the German side, crying out, kill them, and egging them on. Auden sat there in the darkness. He said in 2 minutes, 5 minutes, his whole worldview was turned upside down. He'd always thought we humans are good. A little bit of psychology, maybe, education, politics, all would... No. He said, I looked at this and I knew we had evil in our hearts, and he included himself. But then he was stuck. He said he wanted to say, he had to say, Hitler was absolutely evil, absolutely wrong. Absolutes? Only old fogies believed in absolutes. So he realized he couldn't judge and just say it was relative. So as he put it later, I left the cinema a seeker after an unconditional absolute and met Jesus. Now, in his case, it wasn't very long between that experience in the cinema, the Signal of Transcendence, and the time he came to faith. With others, C.S. Lewis and so on, more than a decade. Muggeridge, more than a decade. Auden, it was pretty fast. But that was the turning point for him.
Yeah, excellent. And most enthralling, really, his story. Thanks for that, Oz. One figure who I must confess, know who mentioned the book before, and I'm glad I now know, was Philip Hallie. Could you tell us a bit about them and what makes their story, again, so powerful?
Yes, that's a very powerful one. He's not so well known as most of the others. He grew up in a rough area of Chicago, gangsters and death and so on. And when World War II broke out, he was sent to Germany, and he was particularly interested in the Nazi atrocities. And after the war, he was Jewish. He made himself a researcher into the horror of the medical experiments, on children without anesthetics and so on, barbarous and horrific. So after 25 years or so of researching this, teaching this in various colleges, he was incredibly depressed. And one night, he was thinking of taking his own life. And he left his wife and his family and went down to his study, and looking at all the books that summarize the evils he'd researched so well. And he thought, well, maybe I should pick up something on the resistance to evil. And he just put his hand, picked up a little pamphlet he'd never picked up before, and started to read. The story of a little village in the southwest France that resisted the Germans and rescued 5,000 Jewish children. He was a Jew, of course. But as he was reading, he said he felt there was a fly in his eye. He put his hand up. It was a tear. All the years of study, his heart had got harder and harder and harder. His heart, he couldn't cry. But as he said, reading that heart-cracking goodness of the Chambonnet opened his heart, and he realized there's more to the universe than the evil that's definitely there. Heart-cracking goodness. The opposite of W.H. Auden in some way, although very similar challenge.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Thank you, Oz. And that brings me nicely to another figure who I absolutely adore, G.K. Chesterton. And like Abraham Joshua Heschel, who you've written about in the past, there's this heavy emphasis on wonder. And there's a great quote, I think, by Heschel, something along the lines of philosophy begins in wonder, I suppose, in contrast to this radical kind of deconstruction and so on today. And I think that's, again, part of why Chesterton's one of my all-time favorite writers. And you show that, and you show how he was larger than life, really. Can you share a bit about Chesterton and what makes him so wonderful, as it were?
Yes. if we were looking at the other wall in my study, I have his autograph.
Wow.
His autograph is as artistic a flourish as his words are, and his whole style of dress were. What a character. A volcano of creative thinking. He was just incredible. Now, Auden grew up in a very Chesterton grew up in a very comfortable circumstances in West London in the 1890s. And when his friends got to college age, they all went to Oxford and Cambridge. But he was artistic in temperament. He thought, no, I'm going to an art college. He went to the Slade School of Art. And you mentioned the postmodern debunking, deconstructing, and so on. The art college in the 1890s was rather like that postmodern mood today: nihilistic, cynical, negative, pessimistic, and so on. And he, by his own confession, flirted with things like the occult in his sketches and so on. But he said the more he went deep, deep, deep into the dark and the negative, he was stopped by one thing. He was stopped in his tracks by a dandelion. I love that. Not a rose or a new birth of a baby or a sunset in the beach with a margarita in your hand. No. Stopped in his tracks by a dandelion. In other words, in all the darkness, cynicism, and pessimism, there was incredible beauty and wonder in the world. And so it made him think, what could explain? What was the system, meaning system that explained both? So some years later, and you can read you probably read it, I'm sure, Marcus, in Orthodoxy, he almost describes like Archimedes shouting, Eureka, as he sees that the Christian faith is bifocal. It explains the light and the dark, the beauty of the world because of God's creation, and the brokenness of the world through the inroads of sin. And his description of what he sees, all the nuts and bolts fitting into place, it's a little too mechanical for me, but I love the excitement in his prose because he sees the Christian faith was the key that fitted the lock. But before he came to that conclusion, it was the years of searching triggered by the humble dandelion. I love that because many people, you're lucky in Ireland and you have people like Paul Kingsnorth who live in the West. You're much closer to nature. You think of people who live in New York City or London or where I live in Washington, D.C. Our son lives on Long Island, little fishing village at the end, Montauk. When my wife goes there, she says it's a world of wonder. But most of us live in cities. Everything's not a matter of wonder. It's humanly made, it's artificial, and we don't have that triggering that Chesterton had and that nature provides. But it's one of the greatest signals.
Amen to that. Was wonderful. And our Irish brother, actually, C.S. Lewis, is another figure, almost between him and Chesterton. You could have a whole lifetime of joy. But one of the things you do focus on is precisely that joy. Could you tell us a little bit about what he meant by that, how he came to joy, and how that contrasts with our smaller notions of happiness today and our hedonist preoccupations then?
Well, I put it in because people only know C.S. Lewis as a Christian writer and, behind the Narnia Chronicles and so on. But of course, for a long, long, long time, he was a hard-boiled atheist. And with the death of his mother when he was young through cancer, and then the horror of the carnage of World War I, and being in Oxford, knowing many of the leading atheists of that time, he was a pretty hard-boiled atheist. But what shook him? The signal that got him searching, as you said, was joy. Now, as he says, joy is not happiness. Happiness is wonderful if you have it. It's all circumstances. Joy is not pleasure. Again, pleasure is wonderful when you experience it, but pleasure is all the five senses. Joy is, as Nietzsche said, joy wills eternity, deep, deep eternity. And Lewis had these incredible experiences of joy, as he says, unsatisfied desires that were more desirable than any satisfaction. And his descriptions of that have been very, very powerful in terms of the yearnings and the longings and the desires that so many people know they have in life. Of course, he was more than a decade as a seeker, searcher, going through all sorts of things until he eventually, as you know, he became the most reluctant convert in all England. Not because he wanted to believe in it, because he was forced by the truth and the evidence to see that it was right. But it was joy that triggered his search.
Magnificent. Thanks, Oz. And there is another lesser known figure, but again, such a magnificent story, really touching. And that is one Windsor Elliot. So, how does the beauty at the heart of her story then go beyond this kind of superficiality of much modern culture and its pretensions then?
Well, she's another of the ones that I know personally. Now, she grew up Southern California, typical background with beach and all that sort of stuff. Went to USC and on a whim started to do some modeling in the summer, and to her great surprise, rocketed from San Francisco to Paris to New York and became a Ford model girl and was on the front cover of Vogue many times. And when she was 19, nearly 20, found herself engaged to a handsome young French baron who was the same age. The world was her oyster. She would go to Paris for the weekends from New York, and her fiancé friend, who was 1922, he was a friend of people like the Duke and Duchess of Windsor and Pablo Picasso and Salvador Dali. And they go to these incredible surrealistic parties in their homes. Well, one weekend, the party was in Salvador Dali's, the ground zero of surrealism. And here you had these people. Some of them had antlers, the women, antlers in their hairs, men with gold encrusted Nero jackets, the celebrities of the royalty of Europe marching around with champagne and other drinks in their hand. But Dali had a pet cheetah, a painted ocelot. And Windsor was looking at this incredible animal. It had been declawed, defanged, desexed, de-everything, and yet lithe and beautiful. It was pacing around between the guests in this reception. And suddenly she looked at the animal and looked at the people. She was struck by the beautiful jungle animal, tamed, was a caricature of whatever it was born to be. And then she looked at the people with all this surrealism. She thought, so are we. And it was as if the floor opened up and she was looking into an abyss of meaninglessness. And she'd grown up in an atheist family. She said to her fiancé, we've got to search for the meaning of life. Came back to New York and they sent her to things like a medium. People at Vogue hadn't a clue to send her in the right direction. After 2 years of the search, I'm cutting the story short without telling a lot of it, she got nowhere. And one night she was walking up Park Avenue and she sort of cried out in the darkness in frustration, God, if you're there, I can't find you. You'll have to find me. About 6 months later, her mother, whom she couldn't stand because of bad blood back in the family, came to live with her because she was dying of cancer. And her mother had shifted from atheism and Hinduism to becoming a Christian. But Windsor said, oh, that's terrific. Christian faith, wonderful one you can die by, but please don't say anything to me. And that was the way they lived. But one day her mother had a couple of people in, and she was showing them Windsor's portfolio of photographs, all her covers in Vogue, Harper's, so on. And the couple gasped. And Windsor was bringing them drinks. Why did you gasp? She looked at the photo. She said, oh, I don't particularly like that photo either. But why did you gasp? She said, they said, you may not believe this, but 6 months ago, the exact time that Windsor prayed her prayer, we were going to a prayer meeting in Seattle. And we were going to get coffee. And we went out through a supermarket, and the Holy Spirit said to us, buy the magazine at the checkout and pray for the girl on the front cover. And they said, this is you. And every day since then, we have prayed for you, not realizing who you were. So the signal was that incredible cheetah. But the search came, and it was sometime later that she came to faith. But another wonderful story.
Well, absolutely, yes. And somebody in contrast then who almost everybody will know that you cover in the book is Tolstoy. And Tolstoy's life really came across, I think, every bit as dramatic as some of his books maybe, and sweeping in some of the themes that come to the fore. And you actually home in on how, again, like some of those other figures we mentioned, he wrestled with these ultimate questions, especially the ultimate question of death, and how this lent itself to a newer and a fuller life. How did that play out then for Tolstoy, and why is that so compelling again then, Oz?
Well, again, a very unusual one. Tolstoy, one of the greatest novelists of all time. So when he'd written Anna Karenina and War and Peace, he was globally famous, world famous, very successful, very wealthy. And he was happily married. He and his wife had 14 children, and he had hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of serfs in his huge estate in Russia. But then in his 50s, when he had everything, he was suddenly struck by the fact of death. I am I, and I'm not going to be here forever. And if you take death seriously for all of us, what does the inevitability of death say about the meaning of life today? And that set him off thinking. And as you know, he renounced his counthood and aristocracy, gave away a lot of his fortune to his wife's great distress, and wrote a different type of book, including the moral fables, in the rest of his life, and became a great advocate of peace. But it was the sense of death striking in. Now, you know, T.S. Eliot says, humans can't bear too much reality. And Pascal points out we surround ourselves with diversions, busy entertaining distractions. Take the social media, cell phones, weapons of mass distraction, they've been called. And all these things, we don't think about life in a profound, ultimate way. And certainly we don't think about death, certainly when you're people in their 20s and 30s and 40s and so on. But of course, death is there for all of us. And the unexamined life is not worth living. And for Tolstoy, it was the fact of mortality that struck him and made him search, and then found. You can read his great book, Confession, to see his incredibly intense, serious intellectual journey.
Excellent, Oz. Yes, thank you. And The Death of the Village is one of my favorite books ever. And I wouldn't be a big fiction reader, but that book really stayed with me. And I think for some of the reasons you mentioned in the book. And Going in a different direction, then there's a wonderful section of the book where you break into almost a rhapsody on love, particularly in this chapter on Whitfield Guinness. Can you tell us a little bit about Whitfield and why love is so vital again in light of eternity, as you hinted at before, and how it really signifies more than this kind of self absorption and our dominant expressive individualist culture? Then.
Well, I put that in because love is so profound. For almost all of us have fallen in love at some time. Now, that story, which is actually my grandparents, they were not seekers. In fact, my grandfather was a medical missionary to China. And I tell the story, you've read it, of the horrendous experiences he went through in the Boxer riots. And he survived by the skin of his teeth when 2,000 of his friends and colleagues were massacred in a couple of weeks by the Boxer rebels. He survived, and out of it met my Swedish grandmother. Now, you know, when we talk about our grandparents, they're old and they've got gray hair or whatever. But of course, in their time, they were as young as we were in our teens and 20s. So my grandfather adored my grandmother. And we have, it's a few feet from me here, we have the little Christmas card that he gave to her the first year of their marriage. And it just runs like this. I don't know if it's original to him or he was quoting someone else. To one who is dearer than life, with a love that is stronger than death. Because he'd thought through love in the midst of the violence and chaos and bloodthirstiness and death of the Boxer Rebellion. And so he saw it with a vividness that many of us don't have. But for all of us, most of us have fallen in love at some time. And you think of all the things that when you're passionately in love, what it assumes and you intuitively know it requires. I think the simplest is the one I mentioned from the pop song. You know, if love is not forever, what's forever for? It's not just sexual or physical or emotional or whatever. when you meet someone you're passionate about, you want it to go on forever. So love is an incredible signal of transcendence. But of course, the big question is, where do you ground it? So we go the Hindu way. Within Hinduism, freedom is not freedom to be an individual, it's freedom from individuality. Well, where's the grounding for love in that? There's nothing. Or take Richard Dawkins, who lives down the road when I'm home in Oxford. The universe is a stroke of dumb luck. Is the feeling of love just a matter of luck? A clash, a collision of chemistry or whatever? No. Person in love knows more than that. Or could it be, as the Jews and Christians understand it, that God himself is love? And back of the universe and the brokenness, God is the supreme person who loves, and he loves us, and so on. So you have a grounding, a foundation, a fulfillment for love. But the point is, the signal gets you thinking. You know, where people go in the search is up to them.
Mm-hmm. That's beautiful. Thanks for sharing. That's such a touching story. And one figure that you relate at the end of the book is the wonderful art historian Kenneth Clark, who I first came to know. There's a Bishop Barron who's got a wonderful online ministry, Word on Fire, and his Catholicism series he focuses heavily on the beauty and showcasing the wonderful architecture of Europe, goes through the Renaissance paintings and so on. And he was heavily inspired by Kenneth Clark. So that took me then to watch Civilization, and I've got the book in the house as well. And you tell his story beautifully in the book, going from this troubled background behind the mask, as it were, and then a dramatic, although a subtle conversion in some ways. Can you tell us a bit more about him and why he's such a marvelous figure that we might learn from today then, Os?
Well, I'm glad you've seen it. Many modern people, particularly over here in America, have never seen Civilization, one of the great series, historically and artistically and so on. So Kenneth Clark obviously was a genius aesthetically. And he has two memoirs, not just one, but two. And he describes a number of experiences that are signals of transcendence. And one of them, the deepest one, was when he was in Florence. And he was in a church looking at a painting. And he said, I was brushed by the finger of God. And he said, the feeling didn't leave me for several months. It wasn't just a few seconds, but something very, very profound. I felt the finger of God. But he said, if I'd gone back to London and shared that with my fellow intellectuals in the art world, they would have thought I was a crackpot. And as we know later from his own biography written by others, he was actually in the middle of an affair. And it would have been rather embarrassing if he'd had to go back and put everything right. And so he says quite candidly, although he felt the finger of God and he felt the sense of it for months, he brushed it off. He didn't want to do it in his life. And many people thought that was it. He had this experience and he brushed it off. But I love the fact that at his funeral, which was a kind of who-who of the arts world in Europe, a priest got up at the end and said, Lord Clark, Kenneth Clark, wants you all to know that he was baptized and taken into the church 6 months before he died. Now, many of the people in the arts world were horrified. What? Another bogus deathbed conversion? What will people stoop to? His wife got up and said, no, this is actually what happened. While he brushed off the finger of God many years earlier, later in his life, many of those questions came back and he accepted faith. Now, I love that because never too late. For everyone, there's a gap between the signal and the search and maybe the discovery. But some people do brush it off. And a friend of mine took that story of Kenneth Clark in the Florence church, feeling the finger of God, and he wanted to use it as a discussion with a group of CEOs. And he thought maybe out of 25 or 30, you might have one or two who would say, yes, I've had some. So he said, how many of you have had experiences like this? And to his surprise, all but one or two said they had. In other words, when people read the stories and think, many of them have had things like that. They go beep, 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 beep. But the question is, have they followed through? Because the signal punctures what they used to believe and points to something else, which, if true, would be incredible. But they've got to take the time and thought and care to really search. And many people do, and many people sadly don't. So I hope the book will prompt people to search more.
Hope so too. And thank you so much for writing it, Oz. And is there anything else we've touched upon the Exodus series? I touched upon this excellent book. You're a prolific writer, as we mentioned. Is there anything else that you're working on now, or that you still feel the passion to get involved with in the future you'd like to tell us about?
Now who are you referring to? Sorry?
Just yourself, Oz.
Oh, myself. Myself. Well, I'm, people think of it. I've written a lot on books like Politics, the Magna Carta of Humanity, and so on, the Jewish roots of freedom. So I'm always glad to come back to things of personal faith. And so I have two books together, and I hope they're companions. One is The Great Quest, which is simply a description of the journey that a seeker would take. Not an argument. Again, I don't believe in arguments like that, but a description of the journey, but people have to take the journey for themselves. Now, this book is the companion book, 10 stories of people who started searching because of these signals that jolted them in their life and set them off on the search. Now, I'm sure you know it, the Irish idea of thin places. I hope that our Western world, which is our world without windows, which has been disenchanted, so many have no sense of the meaning of life. More and more people are going to break out of Plato's cave. And I think listening to the signals is one way in which, the transcendent world can break in, because that's what our whole culture needs today, renewal of civilization through an eruption into this world without windows of the power and the inspiration and the creativity of the transcendent. And I'm sure the Irish have a lot of a part to play in that. And you too, Marcus.
God willing, Oz. And
Your friend Paul.
no, absolutely. Paul and I had a wonderful conversation with Tom Holland there the other day, and the Aslan seems to be on the move with Tom Holland, as it were, also. And it's encouraging to see a lot of these figures who, like Kenneth Clark, have a lot to lose, as it were, with their readership. And there's a lot of kind of worldly factors that they're probably considering if they are to succumb to Christ's call, so to speak. But your work has been most encouraging for me in that, and I'm sure if they come to those figures and your story and so on, they'll be moved by that. And I suppose then, just to close up today, as just to remind our listeners and viewers, where can they find out more about you and your work if they wish to follow up then?
Well, do give my warm greetings to Paul Kingsnorth when you next talk to him, and to Jonathan Pageau, whom I really like too. And if you're again talking to Tom Holland, I've never met him, but I admire his work enormously. No, you can follow my work, books and talks and so on my website, osguinness.com.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your time today, Oz. It's been a pleasure as ever.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
God bless you.
God bless.